Yeah.
I mean, just recently, I mean, this Jim's work there in my time, you know, they paved over the black cemeteries because it's more important. Save them time to many lots of those.
Yeah. I mean, it's well done. And now it's 100 years old. So it's already on so much. So, but I think it just does. It should be a little bit more taken with the. I don't want to go there because of these things, but like when you realize that the laws.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tudor Place. I'm Mark Hudson. I'm the Executive Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the fourth program in our 2023 Landmark Lecture Series. We're so glad to have so many of you here in person at the Dower House, as well as those of you who are joining us on the live stream. So welcome to all of you. This year's lecture series has been exploring groundbreaking techniques used to center the stories of communities traditionally marginalized in historical narratives. This evening's program will focus upon what we have learned and how new information is leading to a more inclusive interpretation of enslavement here at Tudor Place. We'll begin our program with the Tudor Place Indigenous Land Acknowledgement Statement. We respectfully acknowledge the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway people on whose ancestral homelands Tudor Place Historic House and Garden sits. We also celebrate the vibrant Native communities who make their home in the DC area today. So 2 years ago, Tudor Place received an Inspire grant for small museums from the Institute for Museum and Library Services. And this grant was supporting research in the Tudor Place archive and at other repositories in the area to better document the lives of the individuals enslaved here at Tudor Place. And this ongoing work has informed our interpretation of the site and most specifically the guided tours of the historic house, but has also resulted in programs like this year's Landmark Lecture Series. At the center of these activities has been Curator DeHart and Archivist Haley Wilkinson. This evening, they will update us on the research and the work that lies ahead. DeHart has served as curator at Tudor Place since March 2021. Prior to his arrival here, he was history curator at the Tennessee State Museum, where he created several exhibitions, including the award-winning Slaves and Slaveholders of Wessington Plantation in 2014. Rob holds a master's degree in history and museum studies from Middle Tennessee State University, where he also earned his bachelor's degree. Haley Wilkinson joined the Tudor Place team in June 2021. Haley was familiar with Tudor Place, having served previously as a curatorial intern here. She's also served as an intern at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and in various roles at the Ohio History Center. She holds an MA in Art and Museum Studies from Georgetown University and a BA in History from Cedarville University in Ohio. Now, the 2023 Landmark Lecture Series was made possible in part by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of IMLS. Now, it's my pleasure now to introduce Haley Wilkinson, who will lead off our program.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to those of you online. We'll go ahead and get started. This slide is something that Mark talked a little bit about. So I want to talk a little bit about the previous efforts at Tudor Place to talk about enslaved narratives. So IMLS is not the first time that Tudor Place has been awarded a grant to do this work. It's also not the first time that we've dedicated efforts to this. Oh, I'm a little shorter than Mark. Thank you. In the past, the site has acknowledged the layers of labor that sustained the lifestyle of the Peter family. They did so in tours and programs, even some of the temporary exhibitions that have gone on. There were also research efforts dedicated to understanding the resources at Tudor Place that speak to enslaved people. So in the past, we were awarded a grant that hired Maribeth Corrigan, who created this database that allows us to search manuscript references in our archive that refer to enslaved labor as well as domestic labor. So that makes this information a lot more accessible to us as a site. But Tudor Place acknowledged we need to go further. We need to build on this effort and not just kind of let it stop there, and also to expand upon it. So that's where we come in with this IMLS Inspire grant. So one of the first things that we recognized when diving into this work with this grant is that the site, while making efforts, as I mentioned, to provide inclusive narratives, it was clear that it was not up to date with current language practices. Tudor Place now prioritizes more than just the inclusion of enslaved narratives, but the centralization of their stories. But what does it mean to centralize the stories of enslaved people? Well, in other words, we're striving to share the stories of the people who were enslaved through their own perspectives. And you can imagine this is difficult work when we don't have first-person accounts of their experiences. Instead, we make language choices that put the enslaved person as the subject of their own story. So for example, we're in the process, we've rewritten and going through the proposal side of things to basically restructure the part of the website that talks about slavery. So it's titled Slavery at Tudor Place. And in doing so, it's not that we have wrong information or anything like that, but we're readdressing the language that we're using. So right now, if you go onto our website, the introductory paragraph on the Slavery at Tudor Place page reads, Martha and Thomas Peter, like many property owners in early 19th century Georgetown, exploited the knowledge, labor, and bodies of African Americans by participating in the system of slavery. Martha Peter inherited 2 groups of enslaved individuals. Again, that information is not incorrect, but our goal is to centralize these stories to make enslaved narratives, the people who were enslaved, to make their stories and their narratives take the center stage. So a proposed change would look like American history is complicated and comprised of the stories of all who have voluntarily or forcibly called this country home. This includes the stories of the oppression, resistance, and perseverance of generations of enslaved people. It is these stories that are foundational to the story of Tudor Place. So you can see it's just a shift. It's starting, instead of starting right off with the Peter family, we're talking about the experiences of the people who were enslaved. So as you can imagine, language, we understand, is constantly evolving. So there are going to be some language choices that it doesn't matter if it's 2023 or 2040 or 2000, they're offensive and they're not going to be appropriate. Other language choices are appropriate or inappropriate based on the context that we're talking about them. So, for example, we no longer on the site use the word slave. Instead, we try to use the word enslaved. And we believe this language shift is important, but what's more important is understanding why we've made this shift. Slave is a noun that implies at his core, this person is a slave, versus the adjective enslaved reveals that though in bondage, this bondage is not his core existence. So for example, to use the name of someone so you can kind of see it illustrated, Will Johnson was not only a slave, he was a human man with thoughts, feelings, opinions, and experiences. So if I was sharing with you about Will Johnson's story, I would say Will Johnson was enslaved versus just saying Will Johnson is a slave. So when you hear that on a tour, you might not really think anything of it. But when I, the tour guide or the writer, knows why I've made that shift, it's really going to impact the way I talk about Will Johnson for the rest of the information that I'm sharing. And when we centralize stories, we also seek to restore agency to the people whose agency was otherwise stripped by their enslavers. But then, of course, what is agency? And this is something to me throughout the last 2 years is something I've kind of struggled to really grasp. But this is the most simplified version that I have found to kind of help me understand. It is the sense of power or control that we feel in our lives, our capacity to influence our own thoughts and behavior. Agency is our own individual power to affect our futures. And this race-based system of slavery took away this power, or tried to take away this power, this agency, from the people it enslaved. So language can celebrate the agency people sought to reclaim through their lives while enslaved and freed. So, for example, a lecture from 2016, here's an excerpt. One of the dower slaves, Will Johnson, was transferred to Martha Custis Peter when she married Thomas Peter. In his daybook, Thomas Peter listed 21-year-old Will with his mother, Ibby. Britannia Kennan confirmed that Gran Ibby was Will's mother, who resided at Effingham and later Tudor Place. Today, as you can see, it's more concise, but we shift this language to say, Will Johnson was 21 years old when he and his mother, Ibby, were transferred as property to the Peters. Ibby eventually labored at Effingham, which separated her from her son, who labored at Tudor Place. The importance of this shift, I personally think, occurs in the word separated. So instead of saying resided, separated is kind of implying that there's a rift taking place. Something is happening here that not only happens to the physical persons, but also not just their geographic physical location, but their emotions, their mental state, what they're experiencing. And so that's why just one word can really shift that, as well as, again, making sure that we, it's definitely accurate and appropriate to say he was enslaved by Thomas Peter, but this is a way that Will Johnson is taking that center stage. Now, another huge part of this grant, arguably one of the most important things, is that the site has been really working to engage with our descendant community. Descendant community is a community made up of people who were enslaved at some point, the descendants of people who were enslaved at some point. And so it is a great honor to have active members of the descendant community here at Tudor Place, and we are certainly working to engage them on a more regular basis. So I want to share a couple of examples that we have done, are doing, and will do with this group. So in 2021, Rob worked with a descendant to update the family tree visitor's view at the beginning of each house tour. This is the updated family tree. So you can see to the right of this tree, the portraits that obviously we have of the Peter family. We don't have of people who were enslaved. And then on the left side, there's the addition of the Twine family, who were enslaved by the Peter family. Descendants revealed to us a DNA connection to the Peter family. Descendants recall that Hannah Pope, part of the Twine family, was the daughter of Barbara Cole and George Washington Peter. This updated family tree that I've just shown you includes the Peter family and the Twine family together. It also shows that DNA connection, which more accurately presents the entirety of the history at Tudor Place. The descendant community has positively contributed to our work as we centralize stories and celebrate agency. So, for example, our seasonal installations like Death Comes to Tudor Place, coming this October, as well as Christmas tours past and then the one to come in December, are inclusive of all types of stories that lived here. So we're working to talk about all the layers of labor, again, enslaved as well as domestic, and of course, the Peter family. So here is a more specific example of one of these installations. This example is from our 2022 Christmas installation. And you can see, if you had been here, but you can also see, as I'll share some more details about this example, that we've worked to situate elements of the enslaved community throughout the tour, again, to centralize them and to ensure they're no longer just a sidebar of the history presented at Tudor Place, that's a big part of the work we've been doing, is trying, again, bring them from the sides right to the center. So the Christmas tour in 2022 focused on the celebrations of free Black community, Irish immigrants, and the Peter family. And John Luckett was an important part of this installation because we discussed his community celebrations as part of the free Black community. So descendants worked with us to create this panel that you see to the right, which was displayed along objects to represent different gifts popular in the community. So we invite you to join us for the next seasonal installation, Death Comes to Tudor Place, as well as our Christmas exhibition, because we want you to experience this progress for yourself and see what it looks like kind of in the running. And of course, when we talk about installations, we are really looking forward to our spring installation, which will run from February. In case you didn't know, we closed down in January to do a massive clean of the home, the house. And so when we reopen in February, this will give us an opportunity to reset the house. And this exhibition will run then from February through April 16th, DC's Emancipation Day. This installation will focus on the lives and community of those enslaved by the Peter family. And the tours will solely focus on centralizing their stories and celebrating their communities. Again, we are so fortunate to have an advisory group which is made up of our descendant community as well as prominent historians of Black Georgetown that are really helping to assist in this effort. Especially, I've learned a lot about what the community of these people would look like and how important it is that we don't just talk about the individuals, but also their communities. And lastly, I'm going to do another advertising pitch for our next landmark lecture, which is October 10th. We are partnering with Georgetown University to host a conversation with descendants of enslaved individuals associated with Tudor Place, as well as nearby sites facilitated by documentary filmmaker and founder of History Before Us, Frederick Murphy. So you can join us in person. It will actually be held at Georgetown at the De La Cruz Art Gallery. You can put this into your GPS, find it pretty easily. Warning about parking though. You'll need time for parking. But please join us in person, or of course, if you're unable to, online. It's really going to be a special event. If you just type De La Cruz Gallery, it's I think right off of Prospect Street. My geography of Georgetown is poor, so we can show you afterwards for sure. So moving from engagement with our descendant community, the next big thing has been our tour work. So the guided tours of the house, which we offer on the hour Tuesday through Sunday, are given by wonderful volunteers, some of which are tuning in here in person. Thank you guys, as well as staff. And so a big step has been to work with how we train new guides. So our new guide training is really different from those who were trained previous to this update. We discuss language choices like we've done tonight, as well as the most recent updated tour with learning outcomes, which Rob has put together and we'll share more with you in just a moment. And we emphasize weaving these narratives into the tour rather than only discussing them in, labor-oriented spaces. Of course, this training can't stop with the new docents. We have to make sure we're sharing this information with current docents. So that's something that we're continually working on. I think giving them accessible resources on the research we've been working on is vital to this work. And we're really blessed to have docents who ask a lot of questions about this stuff. It's not an uphill battle that a lot of historic sites are dealing with. So we're really grateful for that. And then finally, I just want to mention, we've created an evaluation checklist for education and visitor services to use to evaluate all tours. So volunteers and staff alike. This checklist focuses on the learning outcomes that Rob's going to share with you. That again emphasizes centralizing experiences of the people enslaved by the Peters. So this is just an excerpt of just this part. The checklist goes beyond just this. But really to address the entirety of the museum's mission. And you can see we talk about how people came to be enslaved at Tudor Place, how they got here, do we know? The family tree I shared, as well as individual stories and of course, centralizing narratives. So those are the kinds of things that we desire to look for in all of our tours. Now I will allow Rob to grace us with his part.
Let's see. So these are the tour learning outcomes that she mentioned. I'm not going to go through each one, but I know learning outcomes is an old tool, but for some reason I just now discovered it. And now I use it on everything because it really helps focus everything that we do and make sure that it's just like having a mission statement with an organization. So the big thing that we were trying to address was the legacy of generations of enslaved individuals whose labor was exploited by the Peter family. And the evaluation sheets she showed you, the whole idea is to have a balanced tour. We want interpreters as they go through the house to hit each four of these learning outcomes the same amount. And that's been the real challenge with doing the work that we're doing. But I'm just going to share a couple tools, just kind of like Haley has been doing with language, on how we've been trying to make the narrative more inclusive. And the first one I'm going to talk about is challenging the narrative. So as we're addressing this learning outcome, there's a lot of narratives that have been at the museum since it became an institution in 1988. And this is one example that, quote, "We have no record of Britannia Kinnan emancipating her slaves and seeking compensation under the DC Compensated Emancipation Act, probably because of her pro-Southern sentiments." Now, as many of you might know, the DC provided a means for enslavers to be compensated for the loss of their enslaved human property in 1862. But to take advantage of that, you had to declare loyalty to the Union. So there was a thought going around that, well, since Britannia didn't do this, maybe it's because she was so pro-Southern, which she was. But I think more now, after doing this research, we're leaning towards the fact that probably it's because she had little to no enslaved people by the Civil War. One piece of evidence here is this 1854 day book that belonged to Martha Custis Peter. And you look at it and you see that she is paying people to do gardening, to do washing, to do weaving. So even by 1854, it seems like most of the household tasks are being done by paid laborers. By this time, they had lost most, or sold, or they were leasing out most of their plantations that were in Montgomery County or in DC. So you look at that, and then you also look at some other things, such as from the journals of Martha Custis Williams. She was a niece of Britannia, and she lived at Arlington House. She was born at Tudor Place, but then lived at Arlington House. And you look in her journals, in 1856, she mentions an enslaved person named Stasia. And Stasia was enslaved at Tudor Place at least back to the 1820s. And you see in this first excerpt where she's talking about coming to Tudor Place, and Stasia wanted to see her. Also note how at the end she says that Stasia would bring her bed and put it in the floor in my room if I wanted to. But then by 1859, she talks about Stasia again. And this time, it's clear that Stasia is no longer at Tudor Place. And she says, the getting to her abode was quite a pilgrimage, which I think was code for the fact that she had to go into a working class Black neighborhood to find her house and to visit Stasia. So for sure, Stasia is not there by 1859, and Tudor Place, Britannia is renting it out in 1858. So it seems pretty likely that there were no enslaved people owned by Britannia. And in fact, looking at Freedmen's Bureau records, which these are really only relatively recent, have been so easy to get because they've all digitized, we could find Anastasia Hepburn, which is the Stasia who was living at Frederick and 6th Street in Georgetown, which was a working class neighborhood within walking distance from Tudor Place. And she lived into the 1890s because we know that Britannia was giving her some financial gifts here and there. So from challenging that narrative, we can pretty much put that idea that Britannia is not freeing enslaved people because she's pro-Southern. So it's pretty clear that's probably not true. We have no record of her emancipating people because she just simply didn't have any by the Civil War. Another narrative we looked at was this some of the quotes from her. And, you know, we focus a lot on Britannia's reminiscences because they're an important part of our interpretation. But you have to think about it. There's no one questioning Britannia. She's so old by this time. There's no one telling her anything she's saying is wrong, and it's not the Bible. So it's okay for us to look at these and kind of challenge them. And one of them is where she says, Hannah, who belonged to me, of course, married a man belonging to Colonel Carter, after which Colonel Carter wished to buy her. So I let him have her in 1845, this was, that she might live with her husband, Alfred Pope, and his wife, Hannah. They still live in Georgetown, and a most respected couple they are. So you just have to realize when you look at these sources, there are other perspectives, but a lot of those perspectives might be silenced. So it could be that Britannia needed money and that's why she's selling these people. A descendant of Hannah Pope that we have worked with speculates that maybe it was Hannah's mother, Barbara, who was also enslaved by Britannia, who saw how Britannia was selling off people and influenced her to try to at least keep her daughter in Georgetown, where she would be close by. But also the other thing that's important to recognize is the power dynamic in this quote. This idea of I let him have her, and a most respected couple they are. In a sense, she is taking credit for this union. She could have sold Hannah anywhere. It wouldn't be the first time her family broke up a couple, but she didn't. And because of that, this respected couple is in Georgetown. So I read into this also that she's trying to take credit for this upstanding Black family that is now in Georgetown and her relation to them. So the important thing is we can use these quotes. It's just we have to put them in context and kind of decipher them the best we can and see what other perspectives could be there rather than taking them all for verbatim. The other tool we've been using is developing multi-dimensional representations of the enslaved people. It's very difficult. The sources can be hard to find, but it's a very rewarding experience. And of course, working with descendants like Haley talked about is a big part of this. But what we want to do is we want to interpret people for who they were, beyond their labor and beyond what their employers thought about them. So I'll give you a couple examples. First one here is John Luckett. He was not enslaved at Tudor Place. He self-emancipated during the Civil War and acquired employment at Tudor Place as a gardener from 1862 until his death in 1906. But we just really didn't know much about him except what came from the Peter family, even though what the Peter family recorded from him was very detailed and some really great information. But we were able to expand his interpretation by looking at the records of the church that he attended, Ebenezer Methodist Church in Southwest DC, which is still there. We knew his funeral took place there, but we didn't know he attended there, really anything else about his life there until we looked into the records. So here's a family tree for John Luckett, and we, not just the church records, but the census records helped us with this. Her mother lived with John and his wife Amanda for a while, and these were their 5 surviving children. So looking at the church records, we were able to find that John Luckett and his wife Amanda had joined the church in 1871. And they were very active members. John, in fact, was a Sunday school teacher. And these were very large Sunday school classes. There were over 40 people in his Sunday school class, and it's one of at least 13 Sunday school classes at this church. He had responsibility for raising money. And then you also have to think about how he was able to teach Sunday school for all these years. I'm talking about decades, from the late 1870s to when he died. I found records he was still teaching Sunday school in 1905, and how he was able to do this. And then there's some things in the historical records of the church, and some of these, they don't mention John Luckett by name, but we can make some connections. So like this first one, this is a historical account of the church's first Old Folks Day in 1901. So you can kind of imagine all these people that joined the church in the 1870s, they got old by 1901. So the church finally decided to have its first Old Folks Day. And I really like the last sentence here, how it says the old people shouted and skipped about the youth. And so I have that image of John Luckett and his wife Amanda, who were, getting up there by this time at this Old Folks Day, which according to this had 44 attendees. And this is probably my favorite one. This is from an 1898 pastor's report. And it's a complaint about the youth of the church. Maybe this is John and Amanda's children or grandchildren, but you can be sure whenever anyone complains about young people, it's because the young people are having a great time. So as you see here, in view of the disorderly conduct of the half-grown boys and girls that attended the concerts and company in the church from time to time, the janitor is hereby directed hereafter to allow no one to erect a table in the sanctuary room until they and the parties above mentioned have learned to respect themselves and the house of God as they ought. So I get an image of John's children. So you see this vibrant life that they had. They lived at 222 F Street, which is gone now. It's just a few blocks from the church. But then there's an account in the Peter family, how the Peters wanted to purchase them a place to live here in Georgetown, and they said no. And then you look at this and you understand why. He'd much rather walk miles to work than live up here and lose his community, which he had down there on F Street. One more of the representations I want to mention is Samuel Collins. So I did a talk on Samuel Collins last year. He was a plaster, and he's actually the only name we know of the laborers who worked on Tudor Place on the center block in 1816. And what's great about Samuel, not only did he do great work, but he has a great story, and a lot of the research had been done here at the site, but it just hadn't been incorporated into the tour like it is now. And he was owned by a local lumber dealer named John Pickrell. He was emancipated in 1831, and he might have purchased his freedom for $5. But the way we get into the story about him as a person, beyond his labors, you realize that John Pickrell may have helped manumit Samuel Collins, but John Pickrell still owned his wife and 3 children. That's Sarah Collins on this list, Samuel, Amy, and Louisa. This is when they were eventually emancipated in 1862. So the Pickrell family did still have enslaved people by 1862 and did take advantage of that DC Emancipation Act. But then you realize what a decision this must have been for Samuel Collins. It's like he's freed, he could go anywhere, but he stays in Georgetown. He stays here to be near his wife, his kids, and lives, excuse me, still at the Pickrell house. And then he has to experience the indignity of the fact that a child's status is based on his mother. So every child he bears with that woman becomes a slave to John Pickrell. But looking more into his family, like this family tree, one thing Samuel Collins did, he preserved his family, also passed down a trade for his kids. Samuel Collins, his son, was a plaster, was actually employed here at Tudor Place by Britannia in the late 19th century. And his grandson, Bernard, is also listed as a plaster in DC up until the 1920s. So here's a man who starts at the institution of slavery, is able to gain his freedom, and then also sustain his family and pass down a trade. So now we have this much more human story of Samuel to talk about, more than the cornices that he worked on. And clearly I have to get a drink. And last thing I'm going to mention before I turn it back over to Haley is a question we often get is, where were enslaved people housed? And I think the thing is that when visitors go to plantation sites like Mount Vernon or Montpelier, they see the enslaved cabins. And here it's different. This is an urban estate. Most of the people that the Peters enslaved were at plantations in Montgomery County. They were at one called Effingham, which is near Howard University. There weren't a lot living here, but it's confusing to visitors because they're like, well, where were they? Well, one thing is we've done some archaeology. The first investigation was in 2013 and the second in 2022 that has likely uncovered the site of an enslaved home place, which you see in that yellow square. So it's like if you went out towards Tudor Place, the house, it's out in the garden. It's a fairly large structure. They have found part of a root cellar. They have found butchered animal bone, ceramics, and household ceramics, and some personal items like a toothbrush, a little green-blue bead, which is significant for enslaved sites. So we're feeling pretty confident that's what this was. And as we move forward, it's going to give us an opportunity to do more interpretation on the landscape and maybe put out some markers there, which we're excited about. But we can, so some were probably there, but let's talk about where everybody else was too. So where were they housed? So we know that Stasia and Barbara and Hannah, they were in the house. I made that reference to Stasia's bedstead because I think most likely the enslaved people, they had portable beds. So I don't think when people think, where did they sleep? They expect they had this bedroom, but I think a lot of times they didn't. I think they were just placed wherever they were needed at a time. And we have some accounts of that. We have little bits and pieces of information about Annie Gray and her children who lived at a corner of the property. We're not exactly sure where that was. But then you had some enslaved people who lived off site. William Twine, he was married to a free woman and lived in a house near where the public library is now in Georgetown. So he lived up there. Patty Allen, she was the cook, and she lived with a free husband. We don't know exactly where she would have been during enslavement, and this is kind of a little speculation, but there is an 1850 census that has a P. Allen on it. She's African American. She's about the same age as this woman, and she's living with a family called Crucy down there in Georgetown on Bridge Street near the Presbyterian Church. So we kind of speculate maybe that's where she was. And then also we can talk about where these people went after enslavement. I already talked about Stacia and where she ended up for the rest of her life. And then also Hannah and Alfred Pope, the couple that were upstanding in Georgetown, and that's where their house is, and their house still exists today. So I think this map helps us for us to look, and when we think about where slavery was, it was all throughout the city. And then you also can conjure up this idea of this community like Haley was talking about. You have all these people that are working or enslaved by different enslavers, yet they have a lot of contact with each other. And it's unfortunate that we don't know a lot about that. But that's a lot of what our goals have been trying to bring out these stories, to humanize these people, so we're not just talking about their labor. And so now talking about maps, I'm going to hand it back to Haley to talk a little bit about our partnerships, and she's done some more mapping too.
So the success of this work is in part due to the partnerships that Tudor Place has with other historic sites, repositories, and historians. So for just a brief snapshot of who we've been working with, we have greatly benefited from the work of Mary Beth Corrigan, Heather Bollinger, Cassandra Good, Molly Kerr, as well as sites like Mount Vernon, Woodlawn, Arlington House, Belgrove Plantation, the Fairfax County Historic Records Office, the Library of Congress, and the DC History Center. So many wonderful professionals that have given us inspiration, resources, and insights in that list, in this audience, that we have had the privilege of working with and learning from. Of course, we cannot discuss partnerships without sharing our work with Enslaved.org. Enslaved.org is an organization who's created a database for people to search numerous data sets and reconstruct the lives of people involved in the historical slave trade. You can browse interconnected data, generate visualizations, and explore short biographies of enslaved and freed peoples. We began our partnership about a year ago, learning from their work and looking to publish our own data set with them. Daryl Williams, who is the co-principal investigator with Enslaved.org, has really helped to facilitate this relationship with us. He actually delivered one of the previous landmark lectures in this series in the spring. So if you're interested in learning more, you can check out our YouTube channel and watch his lecture. But we really, really benefited from a partnership with Enslaved.org with their Summer Research Opportunity Program. This program is an experience where individual scholars can apply to be part of this program, and they partner with a historic site. This year it was us, to create a data set from a document. So here we were able to work with them on Thomas Peter's daybook. So this daybook contains a list of people transferred to Martha Peter from her father's estate. And I have to say their research has been very pivotal in my personal understanding, thus the site's understanding of this specific piece. So I want to kind of discuss a little bit, kind of like Rob did, speak about individuals. You know, a lot of what I've talked about is very theoretical. It's kind of out there a little bit, it feels like, unless you're on a tour or seeing an installation. So I want to talk about two specific families. The first one I want to talk about is Bob and Sal's family. And this family is the one that the scholars with enslaved.org really focused on. And so it only makes sense to share kind of where they were. And it was really amazing to actually get to sit in a room of scholars to talk about documents. I know it sounds really nerdy, but even just the way that they were looking at the paper of the daybook and trying to understand how people were organized. And they really, really grasped very quickly that this list of people is their families. And you can actually see how they're organized in the daybook. So here's a snapshot. You can see the red bracket. I didn't put these together. I mean, they're on the list like this because they're a family. So you can see Bob and Sal, who are age 36, may have been husband and wife. We don't know for sure their marital status. They had several children: Will, who was 17, Amy, 14, Kate, 13, Elsie, 9, George, 7, and Ned, 6. Now, these ages are all according to this list in 1796. So as the scholars were focusing on this group, they were also able to trace them back to a different inventory, which I'll show you in just a moment. But I want to start with this visual. I think maps are really helpful when we talk about where people are going, especially if you're like me. And like I mentioned, my geography of this area is pretty poor. So seeing a map is super helpful. So we know that Bob and Sal's family in 1782 were in King William County, which is this kind of orangish red. And then eventually the purple blue is near here where the Peter family are. We don't know for certain that they were brought here exactly in 1796, but in general, their enslavers, at least, are going from this orange to this blue area. So we were able to track this family back to 1782 on John Parke Custis's inventory in King William County, which is Martha Peter's father. Later in the daybook, so I'll just pause for a quick second. You can see Bob, Sal, Will, and Amy. Again, this is in 82, so this is several years before, so some of the children would not have been born yet. And then when we move back to the daybook, later in it, dated May 10th of 1796, about 4 months, maybe 6 to 8 months, there's a range there. After that list of enslaved people was written, Bob and Sal's daughter, so Elsie, 13, Kate, 9, were sold to an unknown enslaver. And then on November 10th of 1796, Bob, Sal, George, and Ned are sold to an unknown enslaver. And this is where the scholars really they were very interested, because if you notice at the very bottom, Sal and George there's a word next to their name. So at this point, Sal is labeled as invalid and George was labeled as insane. So Sal is 36, George is 7. The previous inventories and records that we've just briefly looked at, there's no label that is assigned to them of this nature. And we also can look at their assigned monetary value, which also does not reflect these labels. So until this November date. And while we don't know the reason these labels were applied, we can look at the surrounding circumstances experienced by Sal and George. So at this point, Sal's 13 and 9-year-old girls and George's sisters were sold away from them. Sal was likely aware, I think probably absolutely aware, but as a historian, I'm going to say likely aware, that the system of slavery valued women based on their skill set as well as their reproductive age. So women who are entering into a reproductive age or who are of reproductive age are valued higher than those who are too young or too old. And then, of course, the labor component as well. So if you understand that as a mother and the trauma of losing your children in this way or your sibling would induce a reaction related to the experienced grief that could have been deemed inappropriate or unseemly by their enslaver, Thomas Peter. So in other words, Thomas Peter may have seen their reaction, their grief, their suffering, and perhaps it interfered with their ability to labor. And so he is now understanding that their valuation is going to go down because they are insane or they are invalid. So this could be why those labels were given. And the scholars did some further research into that to see that there is a precedent for this. We're, not just pulling it out of kind of this exploratory, imaginative world that we're trying to also operate in at times. But it is in fact very likely. Just to kind of finish talking about this family, Will and Amy are the only ones that are left unaccounted for. So we don't have any known records to know if they're emancipated, where they go. Their record just kind of ends here on that original list. So this story makes prevalent to us the reality of trauma and immense grief families suffered when they were separated. And it brings to light emotions, perhaps mental states or physical experiences of people enduring this race-based system of slavery. Now, I want to talk about another family. This is the story of the Anderson family, and it's another example of, again, this trauma that is caused by the separation of families. So just a little bit of background about this family. You can see what you're looking at here is the Dower Slave Division list in 1802. It belongs to Mount Vernon, and I'll go into that in just a second, but just so you know what you're looking at. And then to the right, you can see the list of the family themselves. So Agnes, who is the mother, was born around 1766 and enslaved to Martha Washington. Known records put her at River Farm, which is owned by George Washington, as a field laborer from at least 1785 to 1790. While enslaved there, she met her husband, Sambo Anderson. If you're interested at all in this family, Mount Vernon has done a good amount of research on Sambo Anderson. And he was enslaved to George Washington until his emancipation in 1801. So though they're married, they are forced to live on separate properties, which was very common for, if you were owned by Martha Washington and your family was also subsequently owned by George Washington. And so in addition, Agnes's children, Hugo, Celia, Anderson, Ralph, Charity, and Charles, all lived with her at River Farm. Since Martha Washington did not emancipate those she enslaved, they were subsequently divided amongst her grandchildren when she died in 1802, and that's where we get this division list. So there are 4 of them, 1 for each of the grandchildren. This, of course, is Martha Peters. So this means that Agnes, Hugo, Celia, Anderson, Ralph, Charity, and Charles are forcibly transferred to Martha Peter. Again, this information we know from this list, but also the records that were kept by George Washington's people. And you can also check those out on their website as well, which is really interesting. Now, according to Montgomery County land records, Hugo, Ralph, Anderson, and Celia were sent to labor at the Peter family farm in Oakland in 1803. So this is from the Montgomery County land records, just a snapshot where it mentions their names as well as some of the other individuals the Peters are enslaving. And I want to go back to show you this map because I think, again, maps just make it so clear. The red dot is near Mount Vernon, near River Farm, where the Anderson family, minus, of course, their father, are going then from there to the purple and then to Oakland and Montgomery County, which is in red. So it just goes to show how far the separation is, especially when you realize, there's no public transportation for them or cars or things like that. That feels silly to think about, but it really does kind of, for me at least, break it down to a more experiential level. Now, we also assume that Charles was either eventually sent to Oakland to labor, or perhaps he ended up near Oakland because his family was there, because he was arrested in Montgomery County as a runaway in March of 1815. And what's really interesting about this ad, I won't read the whole thing, but it's really interesting because it talks about he has a pleasing countenance. He's very talkative. But even more interestingly, Charles says, according to this ad, that his father had already purchased his freedom. But the ad continues to run through July, so from March to July. And then we also know that Ralph, his brother, runs away in Montgomery County as well, with a runaway ad running from June 12th to June 21st of 1810. And then eventually Ralph is emancipated by Thomas Peter, which so far is, if not the only one of the only ones that I've know of so far that Thomas Peter himself emancipated. And we can find that in the DC Free Negro Register. And upon further research that we've done since looking at this information, it's possible that Ralph moved to New York and began his own family with his wife, Julia, according to an 1850 census, who has the name Ralph Anderson, puts Ralph's birthplace being Virginia, of course, marks him as African American, and has about the same birth year. So it's likely, it's possible. Studying this one family, just the Anderson family, we can see the violence that they endured, but we also see acts of resistance as the Anderson children tried to escape their enslavers. And we can see more avenues to continue to pursue in researching even just this family. I think it's also important to mention, especially in light of talking about partnerships, that this work began with information found by Cassandra Good in her work with Woodlawn, which Woodlawn graciously sent to us. And then we were able to take what she learned, apply it to our documents, and kind of continue stepping forward with it. So it just goes to show this work is best done when we do it with other people.
So a lot of this project has been about how to take this information and get it into our daily tours. So I hope you see that, and a lot of trying to figure out how to create balance and inclusivity in our tours. And I hope you guys are able to see some of the tools that we've used to do that. We've had a great team of docents that have helped us implement a lot of these things. But what are next steps? Well, gosh, I mean, our heads swim half the time with so much information and trying to figure out how to best get it to people. But something that really needs to be investigated at some point is these are lists of Robert Peters enslaved people from 1790. That's Thomas Peters' father, and we really haven't done anything with these names, and it's volumes of these names, and you can just see all these, and each one has a story. And when Robert Peter died, the estate got very messy. He had a lot of brothers, so there are a lot of court documents, a lot of depositions about some of these people. It took so long to settle these estates that some of these enslaved people tried to escape, or other people of the family tried to use them. You start to see the fluidity of the enslaved people in the Peter family and the way they used them. So this is really, and these documents are from Mount Vernon, just another example of how we've worked with other institutions to get copies of these things. But I think this is something that we want to look at sometime in the future, because so much attention has been given to the Custis estates because of their connection to George Washington, but there's really a lot more even in the Peter family that you could explore, because they owned hundreds of enslaved individuals.